to Next Agenda. Joe Makower has been in this field for like 20 years or more. He was here when no one else was around. His two kind of ways to think about this is how business kind of greens itself. At the same time, how do we really think about clean technologies? He's really got expertise in both. He's written about a dozen books. His latest one is Strategies for a Green Economy. He's been thinking in this space for a long time, and he's the executive editor of greenbiz.com. It's great to have you here, and we'd love to talk to you a little bit today.
Thanks,
welcome.
Pete.
Yeah. The first thing we're just trying to do is get everyone's hit on just how big is the problem. Now, there's the meta problem, climate change. We can talk a little bit about that. But the other one is more in the energy sector. It's like, you know, we're on really deeply up to our eyeballs in coal, natural gas, oil. We got to get onto green over time. What's your hit from a business perspective on, you know, how bad is the problem and how fast we got to move on this?
Well, first of all, the problem is even bigger than that because we have this confluence of things going on that start with energy needs and the growing economy in this country and all over the world. And we have climate change, which is the excesses of producing a lot of that power for electricity as well as for vehicles and buildings and other things. But there's also a jobs and economy issue, and there's a public health issue, there's a national security issue, global security issue. There are just a number of things coming together at the same time that we have these technologies and know-how and the holistic thinking, and maybe for the first time, the vision of what's possible that is coming together on the solution side. So this really is a moment that we can be looking at all of those challenges with a relatively singular set of solutions. So
the problem, as you say, is not just the energy problem. It's the interconnected series of problems. But what you're trying, but all of them together, though, are kind of pushing us to act fast. I guess we're just trying to get a sense of how urgent is this? I mean, people think, well, it's something that's so big, it's so out of control. But I mean, how kind of urgent is kind of dealing with this series of problems, you could say?
5,000 days.
What's 5,000 days?
Well, you know, if you think about it, 5,000 days, if you do the math, it's about 13 years, three presidential administrations, if you want to think of it in those terms. That's about, in real ballpark terms, the kind of time we have that we need to turn the corner, that we really need to reinvent so many parts of our world, certainly from an energy perspective. We need to reinvent our automotive systems. We need to invent the way we manufacture things, what they're made of, where they come from, where they go at the end of their useful lives. We need to rethink buildings and the whole built environment. And we certainly need to think about the energy and the water and the materials that it takes to do all of these things, and we need to do that globally. And if we don't have to hit 100% on all of those things, but we need to move pretty far down the path in the next 10, 12, 15 years. If we haven't made significant progress in that period of time, in roughly the next 5,000 days, we're going to find ourselves increasingly getting to a point of no return.
Well, it's in the kind of context of that kind of problem that Gore last fall, or actually last summer, put this challenge out to the country that, you know, what we need to do is big, bold kind of goals and get people moving fast. And he suggested getting the entire U.S. electric grid off of the dirty kind of energy and onto completely 100% renewables within 10 years. I'm just curious what you thought about that kind of goal, or how, you know, how doable that even is from your perspective.
Well, I think it's a great goal. I mean, we really need those big, visionary, bold, audacious goals. And the question is, you know, how do we do it and can we do it? And, you know, I think it's theoretically possible. In order for it to happen, a number of pretty significant things have to fall into place in a relatively short period of time. But what's interesting is that Al Gore, you know, put out that challenge, set that goal, but we're seeing at the company level and at the city level and the state level and in other countries around the world also starting to make those kinds of bold and audacious goals. I mean, Walmart has set a goal of being 100% renewably powered, zero waste, selling primarily, or I don't know, there's no exact metric, environmentally responsible products. Now, they may never get there. I don't think they have a clue of how, I think they have a clue of how they'll get there, but I don't think they have a pathway and certainly not a plan. But the fact that they're even thinking in those terms is pretty bold and audacious, and even if they get, you know, some ways down that path, that's going to be a significant thing. When you think about the fact that 92% of their impacts have nothing to do with what they do in their stores or their distribution centers or the land on which they sit. It's their supply chain. It's the companies that are providing goods and services, 60,000 suppliers around the world. And so it's, those are the kinds of goals, and Al Gore's is one of those, that we need to start getting people thinking in entirely different ways.
Well, when you talked about your 5,000-day thing, the 10-year kind of frame is in that space. So you're thinking, even though it's big and bold and audacious, from what you know, being in this space for 20 years, in the green business space, in the clean tech space, you think it's something that we could do? I mean, there's people that say, "Oh, it's crazy. There's no way we can do it. There's too many kind of constraints." But in just your gut feeling, you think it's a not just a worthy goal, but one that's doable?
Well, it is crazy. No, I mean, it's a crazy thing to think that after all of these years, after 120 or whatever years, 150 years on oil, and 100 years since the automobile really became gas-powered, and after watching all of these alternative technologies, so-called alternative, but now mainstream technologies like solar and wind and geothermal and now biofuels and everything else start to come into the mainstream, how slowly and finally starting to reach the beginning of that tipping point, that we all of a sudden can accelerate that in a decade and get it all right, is a little bit crazy. I think it's possible. I can see how you could do it, but as I think the question is there the political will, is there the business will, is there the public will, and equally important, is there the vision? One of the big things that's missing here is that we don't have a vision of what happens if we get this right.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean?
Well, we know a lot about what happens if we get it wrong. Thank you very much, Al Gore.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people who have shown us in pretty stark terms what happens with climate change and the acceleration and the spiral of negative things that happen. And that's got a lot of people concerned. But, people don't tend to act out of fear. I mean, they do, but not if it's about themselves personally and their lives are at stake or their families and their well-being. But they tend, in terms of societal change, cultural change, which is what's called for here, tends to come out of more positive change. Right? You think about, advertising campaigns in the 50s and 60s, ring around the collar and, things that were fear-based and that, oh my gosh, how the heartbreak of psoriasis, things that were really about fear-based. And now, we don't see those anymore. This is now about the possibility, sex appeal, the better life, even stark medical conditions. The advertising is about this amazing life you can have.
Yeah, interesting.
And we don't have that. So we have not had any of our political leaders, or pretty much any leaders in America or anywhere around the world who has said, here's what happens when we get this right, in terms of economic security, in terms of job creation, in terms of public health, in terms of community well-being, in terms of personal well-being, in terms of global security and environmental security and energy independence, in terms of the better way of life that actually could come from this, the cool technologies that can result from the new kinds of cleaner technologies that we need to bring to bear. There is a happy story here, but I don't know that many people know what it means or know what that sounds like.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the solutions or how to actually start dealing with this problem. And it looks like one of your first things is we need to articulate, we need, whether it's Obama or whether it's political leaders, whether it's, business leaders for that matter, to start to really articulate a new big vision that really people can feel, basically, and really understand at a deep level. That sounds like one of the things you're saying. Is that one way to think of it?
Well, we need that. I mean, that's hardly the ultimate solution that has to happen here, but I think somewhere along the way, people have to get it. And people have to get that green and clean equals better.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even have an idea of what it means to lead a greener life. We have a vision. They tend to be stereotypical,
right,
kind of negative in many cases. You kind of have to, dress in a certain way or drive a certain thing or live in a certain zip code. But it's not, necessarily about health for your family, well-being for your community, the sort of positive influence on the world. But it also doesn't have anything to do with better. It tends to feel like sacrifice or trade-offs or reduction of quality and things like that. And the fact is that there are a lot of clean technologies that are better. That they result, and some of the ways that the efficiency, the radical efficiencies, and the new sort of mashups of technologies that are starting to come into play are actually better. So we did not invent the iPod and iTunes because we were running out of polycarbonates to make DVDs.
Right.
And the DVDs weren't invented because we were running out of vinyl for records. They were invented because they were better technologies that allowed us to do more things in better ways. There's that story to tell about a green lifestyle, about a green economy, about the potential of what happens if we get this right, that nobody's telling, and that's a missed opportunity. And from that, in addition to all of the other policy and technology and finance things that have to come into play,
Yep.
creates not just the ability, but also the will to get this done.
That's great. Well, let's talk about some of these components. I mean, again, you're not necessarily a policy person, but you're coming from a kind of long time immersed in business, and tell me some of the elements that on your hit, from your vantage point, knowing your network and your community, that you'd need, what we'd have to be thinking about as a country to kind of hit a very ambitious goal, let's say, to get our whole electric grid off onto renewables in 10 years. Like, what are some of the things you'd start, like, just putting out on the table of things you really have to be thinking about?
Well, in the broadest sense, we have to get the prices right. So the price of energy, the price of pollution, the price of greenhouse gases doesn't exist, or at least it's not a level playing field. Some things like greenhouse gases right now are free. It doesn't cost you to contribute to global climate change, either as a business or a utility or as a driver or as a homeowner or anybody else. You just do that, and so there's no price on carbon. And there's a school of thought that says that we should be taxing not goods but bads, taxing things that we don't want to happen and incentivizing things that we do want to happen. The way that we get tax deductions for home ownership because the government thought it was made for a more stable society if more people own their homes. And so they created a mechanism for doing that, and that arguably spurred home ownership. Now, we got a little carried away with that in the last few years. That's another story.
Yeah.
But the fact is that we're not taxing pollution. We're not taxing the things that cause pollution in the way, and I'm not even taxing is the wrong word, we're not pricing them in the ways that reflect their true costs. Mm-hmm. So it's been well documented that the true cost of gasoline is not $2 or $3 or whatever we pay at the pump per gallon when you factor in the security measures it takes to get that and protect certain parts of the world to keep the oil flowing. When you think about you factor in the cost of polluting, when you factor in the cost of greenhouse gases and the price that we're having to pay and will increasingly have to pay as a society to mitigate those and clean those up or stop them or address the consequences of those. So the business people I talk to, the CEOs and the CFOs of major corporations, they want this. They want the right price signals because they would like to be engaging and investing in some of these cleaner technologies, but they don't pencil out because they're simply, they don't, you don't get the benefit of the true financial benefits that they bring not just to the company but to society. One of the things that I hear most often that I think is just sort of funny if it wasn't so tragic is the comment that, well, solar and wind and other renewable energies aren't cost competitive without subsidies. Mm-hmm. Well, they're absolutely right. But neither is oil or natural gas or coal or certainly nuclear. And we don't know how much it costs to buy nuclear energy because no one's ever had to pay the full cost of building, operating, decommissioning, and storing the waste and ensuring and everything that happens around that a nuclear power plant. It's all been subsidized by the government. Mm-hmm. If we did, if they had to pay that, we probably couldn't afford nuclear power, or at least it wouldn't be cost competitive. And you could make a similar case with coal and natural gas and oil for vehicles. So if those playing fields were more level, if the costs were right, it would be a very different environment in which these fuels, the cleaner ones, actually could compete and actually would probably win.
So it's a kind of a pricing thing, it's a kind of incentivizing, and I guess kind of equalizing the playing field amongst these things. Are there other elements you'd be thinking about? I mean, for example, the business community, would they, besides just pure energy, there's a lot of interest in much more efficient ways to do things, or setting high standards. I'm just curious the kind of other directions you might think about this.
Well, the technology is changing considerably and coming together in a way that's just now beginning to have an impact. And then over the next 10, 12, 15 years, certainly 20 years, we're going to start to see some radical changes. So for example, there's this convergence, this mashup, if you will, of energy technology, information technology, building technology, and vehicle technology, not just automobiles, but trucks and all kinds of transit, that are starting to come together in some new ways that are really, I believe, transformative in the way that certainly the web, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't really see what was coming. We started to see these things happening. They seemed interesting, kind of cool, but not really changing the way that we live, work, and play, and govern and do everything else. But now we're just, we've been seeing every year some new ways. We saw the way it happened in the 2008 election and the role that new media and technology played. It keeps changing over time. That's where we're going now with technology, and energy technology and some of the other things. And we get to the point where we end up with solutions that not only are cleaner and more efficient, but ultimately better.
So just give me a little bit more beat of practicality in that. Like, how does that work? Like, how would you cross-fertilize those kind of areas? You seem to think there was some synergies or something coming together that it's hard to envision exactly where it's going. But can you give us a little better sense of what you mean by that?
Well, let me give you the sort of the infrastructural piece, and I'll give you a practical application.
Okay, good.
So on the infrastructure side, the way I like to look at what's happening is very much the way that information technology has unfolded over the past 20 years. So here's the history of information technology for over the last 20 years in under a minute.
Okay.
Right? You had a big mainframe computer surrounded by a bunch of dumb terminals that could basically take information from the mainframe. Over time, those dumb terminals got smarter, more self-sufficient, better able to have a two-way conversation with the mainframe, and then able to talk to one another, and then able to talk to just about everything out there from our homes and vehicles and stereo systems and our phones and everything else, and to do so wirelessly. That's the history. Yep. And the way that happened was through hundreds, thousands of innovations that brought down and improved the efficiency of disk drives, disk storage, and microprocessor speed, and broadband technology, and 100 other things, to the point where this technology is so cheap and ubiquitous that it's almost free, that we don't think about how much we're downloading, how much time we spend online, how much time we spend on the phone, right?
Right, gotcha.
So that big power plant that's 15 or 20 miles from here, that's the mainframe.
Yeah.
And we're sitting in one of the dumb terminals. It's where we live and work and do everything. And over time, those dumb terminals are going to get smarter, more self-sufficient, more able to have a two-way conversation with the mainframe, better able to have a robust conversation with other things, other terminals, vehicles, cell phones and PDAs and everything else, and ultimately to have this very much integrated conversation, and a lot of that will happen wirelessly. So the challenge and the opportunity here, from a business perspective, is what are the thousands of things and the hundreds of subcomponents that have to happen, that need to be invented, so that energy becomes so cheap and ubiquitous that we don't even think about how much we're using. It's sort of free. And how do we decarbonize it along the way? In other words, make it from renewable sources.
Right.
That is 180 degrees from drill, baby, drill,
right,
which is all about more supply.
Right.
So what does that look like? So here's one example, and there are probably dozens of them. So in America, it's become dogma that cars give us freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even think about that. And we know that. That's just the American way. That's why everybody has a car or two, and the whole society is built around that. But when you think about it, it's not cars that give us freedom that much, because you got to buy them and pay, fuel them and insure them and repair them and maintain them and store them, and sometimes that's not easy and cheap. What gives us freedom is mobility.
Right.
And specifically mobility on demand. So what if you could say, I want to go, do some errands, and it's just me, and I'm going to pick up a few groceries, and or I'm going to go to Home Depot, and I'm going to pick up a bunch of 2x4s, or I'm going to go away for a week with my 6 kids and spouse, and we're going to camp, or it's a beautiful day, and I just want to go for a joyride with the top down, and that vehicle, whether it was a scooter or a truck or convertible sports car, whatever it was, would show up wherever you were within some agreed time frame. And maybe you say, well, it's time critical, I'll pay the top rate, so I need it in the next 30 minutes, or I'm not in a hurry, I'll need it anytime the next 4 to 6 hours, so I'll get the cheaper rate. And you got to do that and then go do whatever you did, and someone comes and takes the car away. That's freedom.
Yeah.
That's mobility on demand, and that's made possible by this convergence of technologies. Oh, and by the way, you're charging it at home, maybe from solar energy if it's an electric vehicle, and a whole range of other things. That's just one small piece of what gets to happen if we get this right.
Well, so let's say we did. I mean, that seems like a kind of vision that, one, is plausible and actually desirable. But now, so we're trying. We've got an opening here with the Obama administration, a new Congress, a shift in our politics, a collapsing economy, a new appreciation of activist government and public investment in new things. I mean, where would you be advising, if you could get your 2 cents in that kind of conversation to those folks? Where should we be putting the money? Again, thinking a little bit to keep it a little more focused on radically accelerating our shift to renewable energy, and in particular kind of getting this on the electric grid that you were just talking about there.
When you think about how any technology has come not only to market, but come to scale where it becomes ubiquitous and affordable, whether it's transistors that became microprocessors, or cellular phone technology, or even radio, or some of the early technology, automobiles, is there's really 3 levers that you have to pull. There's the technology itself, there's the policy, government policy, that can help drive behavior of companies as well as behavior of individuals, and through taxes and incentives and any number of different things. And there's finance, the money it takes to drive all this. So let's take solar energy, for example. You could pull one of those levers really hard. So you could come up with a breakthrough technology that all of a sudden brought the cost and improved the efficiency of solar energy from where it is at a few bucks a watt at a 20% efficiency for polycrystalline solar to twice or 3 times more efficient at half or a third or a tenth of the cost. You could pull that lever really hard, and that's a long shot that's going to happen. But that would would clearly move things much more quickly. You could come up with all kinds of money and incentives and tax rebates and other kinds of things, and have new business models that start to come into play. And we're starting to see some of that now. That because one of the barriers to solar is we're not used, whether as businesses or consumers, we're not used to owning the means of power production for our homes and businesses. We're used to buying kilowatt hours based on what we need so that we have cold beer and warm showers, but that's really ultimately what we want. So you could come up with some financing methods that eliminate that. Or you could come up with a policy solution that mandates that every new building has to have solar, or some version of that, or that there's, and of course the policy could mandate the financing, and there's versions of this. Usually these things happen not because any one of these levers is pulled really hard, but because they're manipulated in the right way at the right time. And so that's how we have to think about it. You could actually create a 3x3 matrix out of this, where you've got technology, policy, and finance on one axis, and on the other, standardization education, and market aggregation. And if you plot those 3 by 3 and you end up with the 9 squares, you kind of start to see that the pieces that have to happen for solar or wind or electric vehicles or any of these technologies to come into the mainstream, to get to scale where they become cost competitive or even.
Talk about those 3 on the other end of the matrix, not the first 3 that you talked about, but give me a little more beat on what you're talking about there.
Well, education. I mean, we have to educate the consumer, the marketplace. We have to educate businesses. We have to educate policymakers. I mean, they just need to understand. There's so many myths and misunderstandings about this stuff. There's lack of appreciation for where the technology is at. There's still so many stereotypes and old thinking about so many of these technologies. So we need to educate everybody, the market, the politicians, business leaders throughout society. Standardization. We need, if you have few states doing a few things and some states doing no things and several other states in between, this patchwork quilt of regulations versus a national standard, not just a standard that we're going to get to say 20% renewables by a certain date, but also the interconnection standards, getting some really technical geeky stuff, building codes and other kinds of standards that you need. There's hundreds of them. I mean, just the standards you need to create an electric vehicle infrastructure so that you can, a car can buy and sell power and do that across state lines or service utilities. I mean, you need some kinds of several standards there. And then the aggregation, market aggregation. Obviously, if different states are mandating different kinds of solar panels. The state, let's say a state decides they want to invest in solar for all their buildings. They want all state buildings to have solar on them, or at least as many as they practically can do. But they do it, they specify it a little bit differently. And so now you've got manufacturers that are building different things for different states and different markets. We need the market aggregation where they come together and say, this is, we need winners, and just as we now have, you go to a gas station and that's a standard, and there are certain ways that everything happens. You don't have different kinds of fueling in different states. Right. That's a combination of standardization and market aggregation where the economies of scale played in, so that to create, the ways that we ultimately ended up doing lots of different things in this world. So when you put those together and you go against technology, policy, and finance, you start to see that there's sort of 9 ingredients in there that need to come. Now, in any different technology at any given moment, 1 or 3 or 4 of those boxes that result of those 9 boxes are going to be more important, more critical, or have a better leverage point, be a better leverage point at that time. But you kind of have to look at the holistic picture here, because if you just look at the technology, or if the technology comes to play but people can't afford it and government isn't helping, or if the government creates a policy and the technology's not there yet to meet it, or that there's no businesses that are putting in money, investing, making the financing available, or creating the business models that will allow people to have it, this stuff doesn't happen. We need that holistic view for any one technology and for the whole portfolio of technologies that we need to deploy in energy, in vehicles, in buildings, IT. That's the kind of thinking that needs to happen.
So I'm hearing you, and you had started earlier in the conversation about the need for a vision, a kind of unifying vision. In some respects, it's kind of, that's the first structural piece that pulls us all together. And if you really think about it, if you thought of all the actors in society who could pull this off, there is, without being too, slavishly devoted to the federal government, there is a kind of a role, though, it seems, for a strong political kind of vision and a strong political voice that actually has the authority and the reach, essentially, to really pull all the elements together. Would that be the right way to kind of frame this? As opposed to, let's say the last couple of decades, we've been thinking it's much more let the market, let a million kind of people try this stuff out. It's just kind of emergent kind of phenomena, and eventually it'll all get worked out. I'm just trying to clarify a little bit from your perspective of, you're looking a little bit more, I think we need for more focused, conscious, directed energy from the government, would you say?
Well, that would certainly help. I mean, policy was one of the big levers, and having that standardized policy and the bold and audacious policy would be a huge lever in terms of, getting us where we want to go. But one of the things that's sort of remarkable, Pete, is if you think about, or as I look back at the last 8 years,
Yeah.
is how far we've gotten, how much has happened with zero, virtually, very little federal government leadership from either the White House or Congress. And I'm not saying that was a good thing. It would have been much better. We could have gotten much further faster had we had some leadership. But what's happening in the private sector is really remarkable. So if you think about it, almost every sizable company is now in the energy business. So we think about,
what do you mean by that?
well, we think about utilities, and we think about oil companies, and we think about some of the new, solar and wind, and and then the coal companies and those traditional. But there's this whole other, many other worlds of this. So, for example, what we know about agriculture, the biofuels, whether it's from corn or what's called cellulosic from waste products, agricultural waste, or specially grown biocrops grown to produce fuel. They're in the energy business. Also, farmers are putting up wind turbines in their pastures and solar panels, and so they're very much in the energy business. Big companies like Archer Daniels, Midland, and Cargill, the big ag companies, they now are in the energy business. In fact, the president of Archer Daniels Midland used to be at Chevron. The car companies are very much in the energy business now. In January 2008, I attended a meeting at GM's Research and Development Center in Warren, Michigan, where they brought together about 35 senior executives from utilities around the country to talk about how do you create the infrastructure for the electric vehicle, for electric vehicles. Because you think about it, it's not simply a matter of I have a plug, I have a socket, I have a vehicle, end of story. First of all, not everybody has a plug. If you live in New York City, you don't have a socket you can plug into. Even if you have a garage, you may not have a plug there. Or if you have a plug, it may not be the right voltage. Yeah. I have a plug in my garage. It happens to be on the same circuit as my bedroom. And you plug in a vacuum or something and TiVo freaks out, right? So there's just a lot of issues here that you have to deal with. And so the automobile companies, now that they're all moving towards electric vehicles, are very much thinking about storage and how those cars become not just a power user, but a power generator for the grid as a backup power. You've got the electronics companies, they're all in the energy business, the Sharps and Sanyos and Kyoseras. Sharp, until recently, was the largest solar manufacturer in the world. You've got the big iron companies, the John Deeres and Caterpillars. I mean, first of all, a lot of their customers are putting solar and wind in their buildings or on their fields. They have huge developments in this. Obviously, financing and service sector kinds of things where they're manufacturing and maintaining these things. You've got certainly the finance community, or what's left of Wall Street these days, the Goldman Sachs and others that are making huge bets in investing in wind farms and solar farms and other things because they need the money to build these things, and it's been more challenging lately since the credit crunch. You've got the IT companies, the Ciscos and IBMs, and you've got because a lot of this is switchers and routers and software. Microsoft is into this. You've got the aerospace companies, the GEs and United Technologies and Boeings. Boeing just set up a new company to just help make their customers more energy efficient. GE, of course, they're the largest wind turbine manufacturer. They make the world's most efficient natural gas power plant. United Technologies is big in fuel cells. You go on and on and on. I mean, and even Walmart is now, they have a utility. And a lot of big retailers are putting solar on the roofs and to generate electricity and to think about what they do from a new perspective. And even companies, here's one last example. Coca-Cola. They're in the energy business? In a way. So they did what a lot of companies have done, which is they did a carbon footprint analysis of what they do. And you think about what they do. They source bottles and cans. So it's aluminum, which is a heavy greenhouse gas emitting manufacturing process, and plastic, which comes from oil, and glass still in some parts of the world, which is very energy intensive, melting sand, basically. And they source lots of water. Very energy intensive. About a third of all energy used in the state of California is used to move and treat water. And then they make product and they ship it. They have about 1,000 bottling plants. And if you were to take every vehicle in the world that had a Coke logo on its side and assume erroneously that it was a corporate-owned fleet, they'd have the largest fleet in the world. What's the biggest part of their carbon footprint? I won't make you guess, I'll just tell you.
Yeah.
It's Coke machines. Coke machines and soda fountains in restaurants, we put your cup in there, and marketing equipment. If you go into a 7-Eleven and there's a refrigerator that's got Coke on it, that's company-owned marketing equipment. That's the biggest part of their energy footprint because it's the energy it uses, it's refrigeration, but it's also the insulation and the coolant, the refrigerant, are huge greenhouse gas emitting chemicals. So they've gone into the business. They actually partnered, believe it or not, with Greenpeace, but also with McDonald's and Pepsi and a number of other companies, Unilever, to create some new technology, freezers and refrigerators, that are starting to be deployed in China and around the world. So they're all of a sudden in the energy business. And that's this convergence I'm talking about.
Well, this is interesting. So if we think of the solution, if we think of hitting a kind of audacious goal for the country to radically shift its energy sources, but also get much more efficient, we've just been talking about how the private sector, basically devoid of government kind of policy making and devoid of direction even from the federal government for that matter, it can do a lot and can go a long way, and it already is doing a lot, and it has gone quite a way. Is that the right way to think of it?
Well, I'm not saying that business has gone far enough, fast enough at all. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, we barely scratched the surface, just playing at the margins to some extent. But could you imagine, and I didn't even really cover the full landscape of this, but what could happen if there were some mandates or leadership or visions or incentives or subsidies or any kinds of pricing signals that would basically make all of these things much more profitable, and the incentives to do them, the carrots, much more attractive, and the vision and the political will, there. I mean, one of the upsides, one of the benefits of having the political will or the business will or the public will is that this stuff becomes a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That we equate green and clean with better, to the point where people say, well, why wouldn't we do that? Mm-hmm. We have these great new capabilities, these new products and services. They're being made in a lot less polluting ways. I feel better about them. Our companies are more profitable. We're doing it domestically. Why wouldn't we do that? Mm-hmm. That's where this stuff starts, to really catch fire. Maybe a poor metaphor, but it really starts to hit critical mass, and that's where it becomes basically much as the internet. Why wouldn't, if you were to build a business today, why wouldn't you use the internet? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You don't even think about it. If you were, if you were to run a business today, why wouldn't you, use the cleanest, most efficient technologies? And right now, we don't have a good answer for that because the signals and the demand and the leadership isn't there.
But if we did have that signals, we did have that leadership, we did have those policies, it's what you're saying is the business community in many different manifestations is ready for this, is moving in this direction, would love to get catalyzed faster, and again, in almost a no-brainer way. Let's just do our last, as we kind of wind up the interview here a little bit more. Let's think about just citizens or consumers. I mean, my understanding is, what was it, 20 years ago you wrote one of the early books on the green consumer or something, right?
That was the title.
Is that the title of it? Yeah, exactly.
In 1989, I wrote a book called The Green Consumer.
And this is kind of, people today, Americans today, I mean, it'd be interesting from your point of view of how open are they for this kind of transformational change? What could they start doing, and how important are they in the role of this kind of veritable transformation we'd have to go through very quickly here?
Well, citizens are very important. I mean, 70% of the entire gross domestic product, of all the economic activity in the United States, is at the consumer level. So consumers have to be a part of that. The challenge is that consumers have been talking the talk, but not walking the walk for, 20 years that I know about. In 1989, when I was writing my book, The Green Consumer, the first ever survey of Americans came out by a now defunct organization called the Michael Peters Group, surveyed 1,000 Americans, and came up with these eye-popping, jaw-dropping statistics that said that 89, I think, % of Americans, 9 out of 10 Americans said they wanted to make greener choice, and 60 or 70% said that they would be willing to even pay a price premium for the privilege of doing that. And over the past 20 years, those data have not changed. Every year, it used to be just in April, around Earth Day. Now, 6, 8, 10, 15 times a year, we see surveys that have some version of that there's some huge demand for basically for green products from good companies. But while that number hasn't changed much, neither have people's shopping habits. Because underneath that desire come a whole bunch of conditionals. I would make the greener choice if it came from a brand that I already know and trust, if I buy it where I already shop, if it works just like the other one works, if it's priced like the other one works, if it's at least as good as the other one is. In other words, if I don't have to change or do much differently, and if it has some other benefit to it besides being greener. It saves me money, if it's healthier for my family, if it lasts longer, if it's simply cooler. And there are very few products that can clear that hurdle. I mean, the Toyota Prius is one that comes close to that. It's a Toyota, we know the brand, you buy it where you buy Toyotas, you fill it up where you buy gas, you drive it pretty much like you would drive it, no too many changes there. It costs a little bit more, it doesn't quite pencil out, but there are some savings. And it does, it doesn't really require too many changes, and it's kind of cool, at least it has been, sort of this badge of honor. But beyond that, most other products are actually the opposite. They cost more, they don't work as well, you have to buy them from a different place, you have to use them differently, and did I mention they don't work well? And so, that's been a problem, and I think right now the irony is, and the tragedy in some ways, is that green products and services often start with a negative connotation. People assume that they're going to be inferior. And so we have a lot of proving to do that these, first of all, improving the technologies, improving the products, and they're now starting to come into the marketplace. But we need to show that they're better products and better, and consumers, I think, will be there.
Well, as we kind of close out here, they've got the right attitude. We're getting close. We got businesses maybe getting close to providing them. I mean, how hopeful are you, or how confident are you, maybe another way to think of it is, that we're up for this 5,000-day transformation, that we could make, really dramatic strides, whether it's hitting the kind of Gore challenge of getting the grid completely renewables, or the kind of concomitant transformation through the whole kind of society, sustainable society that we've been kind of talking about here. I'm just curious where your gut feeling is about how hopeful you are.
Well, I'm very hopeful. I mean, I wake up, I think, most days on the optimistic side of the bed. If I didn't, I don't think I'd get out of the bed. But confident is maybe not as much, because there are so many things that have to come into play. So much leadership, so many investments, so much change on the part of the mindset, at least, and also on changing the business processes and products and whole systems of commerce in some ways that need to happen here. There's so much going on, and we've come relatively far relatively quickly without the kind of leadership we need, and yet we're still kind of playing at the margins. This is, the question is this far enough, fast enough? And I'm pretty sure it's not. And the question is it too little, too late? And I hope it's not. I think we have an opportunity here. There's a moment in time that we can, we have a sort of a new leadership. We have this confluence of technologies. We have this unfortunate economy, but I think that once we start to come through that, the money's going to be there. Certainly the technology is going to be there. And we have the ability, if we have the right incentives, if we have the right political will, to really pull this together and change this, not just get out of, avoid some problems, but actually create some very cool new ways of living, some great lifestyles and healthier communities, and a better way of life. And that ultimately has to be whatever better means, whether it's more secure, healthier, or more prosperous, or less fearful. That ultimately has to be what this is all about. I think we can do that.
That's a great place to end. And we really thank you for being here and being part of this Next Agenda process. We hope that you stick with us and keep part of the conversation for the long haul here.
I look forward to that, Pete. Thanks.
We just finished a great interview with Joel Makower, and this is Next Agenda. And stay connected and come back next time and be part of the Next Agenda.